clear as mud. Certainly, certainly talk with either RJ or Jennifer between now and Monday if you do have questions or try to bring this forward. Again, supplemental budgets aren't a bad thing, they're an okay thing. It's just bringing back up to speed where we actually are in a given year versus where we're forecast to be many months ago, so. That one will be, or those ones will be on Monday's agenda?
Yes. And there'll be two separate, we'll present them as two different ordinances. The first one talks about the reductions that we did. The second one has all the other items, pet tunnel.
Mr. Mayor, just very briefly, I think the key message out of that, thank you, RJ, is that they're still with the cost-cutting measures that have taken place this year, basically $1 million in operating expense reductions have already occurred, and this adoption of the supplemental budget will consummate those reductions formally. And then I think the second takeaway is the set aside of those restricted EMS funds because of the supplanting issue and prudent accounting to keep those in a separate fund for tracking and moving forward and expending against that. And as we get more of those types of funds, we'll be cutting into that.
In addition to the $600,000 that's going from reserves into the restricted fund for EMS, what other reserves were used to balance the budget this year? Just an amount.
We won't know until the very end of the year how much we'll have to come out of general fund reserve in order to keep the general fund whole at the end of the time. So it's, the estimate is, in our next presentation, I think we've got an updated estimate,
Yeah.
which I can turn to now, or 300, 400, something like that for 10.
In addition to the $600,000 for the EMS.
Correct.
Okay.
Those 600 are locked. They can't be used for anything else anyway.
So we're talking about $900,000 to $1 million.
Not really, because the 600,000 isn't an actual expense. All we're doing is taking it out of, it was basically dumped into general fund reserves last year instead of keeping them as a separate fund dedicated just for those. So what we're doing, they're still there, we haven't spent them. And all we're doing is breaking them out of that category so that you can clearly see that they are additional funds and are restricted just for those uses.
But we will begin to spend those this year.
We, potentially we could spend them this year, yeah. They're there to be spent. Our understanding is unlike impact fees, there's not a time commitment on those to where they need to be spent. The restriction is that they need to be spent on EMS related issues themselves and expenses themselves. But it's, so basically what we've done, Dave, is kind of taken them out of general fund reserves and put them into EMS savings. So that they're being used for certain things, but not for all, even ongoing expenses for EMS. Some of those can't necessarily be spent from those. But our attempt was to basically try and better, for everybody's knowledge, just to better identify those so we know exactly where the pockets of money were and what they can be used for.
Will we then contribute to this fund every year as kind of a sinking fund towards the time when we need to buy more vehicles?
To the EMS fund?
Yes.
No. That's one that will actually be set up that if we do it correctly, we'll continually spend from until it's down to zero.
I think you're thinking of the equipment replacement funds that we're gonna talk about in a little bit. This EMS fund is separate from that. It's EMS levy funds that are dedicated to be spent on supporting the EMS program.
But we're taking those out of reserves as a one-time measure, right?
No, they're,
They were actually added to reserves last year
From revenues.
from fire, what do we call those, fire?
They're levy.
10-cent levy, lit.
Yeah, but they were identified in the budget.
We had them separated their
It was
own
all
fund,
together.
and that was their cash balance of 1.4 million. Part of the idea with the original budget was to take 1.4 million, the cash reserves that fire had, plus another 600,000 from contingency.
I'm not so much interested in how we created the reserves. I'm interested in where the money came from. Because if we're taking it out of reserves, I want to know if that's a one-time affair. And are we going to create a fund and put revenue into that fund every year so that we don't have to do this again?
No.
We shouldn't call it a reserve, taking it out of reserves, because it's not coming out of reserves. They were placed there as a placeholder, but they're not general funds in the sense that they're just part of our general funds.
Okay, so they came from tax revenues.
They're
Oh, yes.
Restricted property taxes pursuant to the levy limit for EMS services.
Gotcha. So this is just an accounting maneuver?
Yeah.
It's an accounting maneuver in order to have a cleaner accounting and a cleaner auditable record of our restricted EMS revenues.
For which I thank you.
John?
Was the EMS ever really even supposed to go into that reserve category? Or were they put in there to kind of bolster the numbers of the reserve?
Yes and yes. My belief, yes and yes.
Essentially, I'm Paul Lewis, I've done background research on this issue. When the voters approved the 10-cent levy lid lift in 2006, it increased your property taxes for 6 years, beginning in 2007. That increase is restricted to EMS services. The assessor's office and the treasurer's office don't tell you how much of that revenue is restricted when they send it to you. They send you just one lump sum. So what we've done is gone back and figured out how much of that revenue was really restricted over and above what we used in the specific year that we received it. And so that accumulation from 2007, 8, 9, and now 10 is 600,000. That's our estimate as of the end of this year. So instead of having that sit in general fund reserves where it could potentially be used for other things, from a policy matter, it has to be used for EMS.
Right.
So this transfer puts it in a fund that's labeled EMS, so everybody knows that that's all it can be used for.
So we should have been earmarking that money.
It is
back
very
in-
hard
Back
because
in '07.
Uh,
What you're saying?
you would have had, you could have asked the assessor to help you earmark it, but it's a complicated transaction to figure out actually how much of that revenue is excess. And so we've gone through that exercise, and actually one of the things we're gonna do is follow up with the assessor's office just to confirm how that's gonna impact. Because it's something that you'll have to track 11 and 12 as well.
Now, is this something that, maybe you don't really have to answer, but is this something Camus is already doing? I mean, they have a
No,
separate.
this is particular just to our 10-cent levy lid lift.
Which is
That we have.
a good point, because there's two sources of EMS restricted revenue. One is the EMS levy, which the voters just passed at 50 cents per thousand. And the second is the EMS levy lid lift, which was passed once in 2006, which is just they passed it at 10 cents over they passed it actually at a fixed rate, so.
Okay.
So wasn't that put aside already and then you pulled it over and then now it's gonna go back?
No, what ended up happening, I believe, if you look at all of the numbers in total, they may not be exact, but they're pretty dang close. I'm not so sure that Becky wasn't correctly keeping those separated out, and I don't know that there's anything written up along the way in that. But in late part of the year last year, those were moved over, as well as the building contingency funds for the City Hall campus that were there, another 600,000. We're simplistic terms, which are probably a little bit off base, basically saying we don't really need those funds, let's just take them and flood them into general reserves. And that's how they ended up there. When Paul started the work earlier this year is when he found a little bit of discrepancy in that 2007 assessed valuation that threw us way out of whack and then has come down